Welcome back, everybody. Let's go ahead and get started with looking at some of these content examples and try to demystify what the post-process volume does and what it is capable of doing. Now, my general wisdom is to always go to the documentation for any of these elements because they generally help you demystify what's going on. But as of at least current, some of the documentation has not been updated to reflect that there are no longer some options available in the post-process volume. Some of those options have been moved into the rendering tab. And also, for this particular example, in order to get all of these to work, I have disabled Lumen for this particular sample. Now, when I do my actual sample and I do my actual example, I've got a lovely virtual machine that we're going to be using, and I'll be able to do everything with Lumen turned on, and I will demonstrate what the post-process volumes will do with Lumen on and off. But this first section is supposed to illustrate what the post-process volume does, how it works, what each of the settings are, and as I walk through what they do, I think it will help demystify what the effects available to the post-process volume are. Those effects aren't just limited to just changing the color and the shadows, but you are also allowed to change things like, it used to be anti-aliasing, but that's no longer in the list. Although if you look at the documentation will say that you can control anti-aliasing still through the post-process volume. You can no longer. There are some documentation papers about the FXAA that is used inside of the Unreal Engine 4 and 5. However, I'm not going to cover anti-aliasing for this particular demo, mostly because, well, it's not part of the post-process volume anymore, and it's part of rendering. There's auto exposure, there's bloom, there are blendables, we have color grading and filmic tone mapping, we have depth of field, we have lens flares, we have projections, we have post-process materials, we have chromatic aberration, also known as scene fringe, which is just a camera effect. We have screen space and also lumen reflections, although this current project is set up for screen space reflections, which is not lumen reflections, mostly because screen space reflections look fine, and I've already shown you guys in a previous demo what lumen reflections look like and why they're incorrect. We have vignetting, and then we have lookup tables like LUTs. Let's go ahead and go through this together, and this will help demystify what each of the effects do. What you're looking at right now is the default post-processing. The default setting for post-processing is set up when the camera is not within a post-process volume, or if you do have a post-process volume, you don't have anything affecting the way that the camera is supposed to look. A quick note, I'm looking at these with the game camera. There is a cinematics camera that is available over here. Oops, sorry about that. Right here, for the cinematic viewport. It simulates a cinematic camera for the purpose of cinematic effects. As you can see, I've got my context examples right here. You guys also have access to this if you go to the Learn tab and download the content examples. But this helps you kind of digest these as I combine my understanding of the documentation with what the examples are doing. As you can see, there's a little bit more quality in terms of what the camera is able to see. But this camera does not perform super well when it comes to the game camera. It's not essentially a default camera. The default viewport is going to be what you want to use predominantly for most of your stuff. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and hit play, and we're going to go and have a look here as I talk through this. Alright, so again, as I mentioned, the default settings are set up for while the camera is not within a post-process volume. This is just generally the default that the world is going to look. Unless there's a post-process volume that's unbound, that's going to affect the world. Generally speaking, the default settings are going to look like the rest of the world. Again, this is also based on the location of the camera. This is a first-person character where the camera is located where the head is. If you are in a third-person point of view, you need to account for the fact that the camera might not work immediately until it actually enters the post-process volume. The film or filmic category contains more properties than you could actually shake a stick at. So let me explain what we're looking at here. This context example is set up pretty straightforward with some static meshes of various colors from RGB and a gray to showcase midtones. We have an RGB midtones, and then high whites. And then we have the same thing set up at the floor. This is so that it's easier to observe during the recording and during the explanation what this is supposed to be in relation to how the post-process volume is working. The film category, of course, is going to adjust the color properties of your scene. This includes things like color tinting, any shadows, any kind of color mixing you're going to be doing, saturation, contrast. If your shadows are crushed, VFX people, you'll know what crushing shadows means, crushing highlights, and any kind of HDR or high dynamic range. Let's go ahead and let's see if I can. Come on, give me control. Let's pop into these film volumes here. As you can see, the color changes from our standard overview color to like more of a bluish tinge. We have kind of like a reddish hue with a little bit of a graininess to it, and then we have more of a desaturated look. If you want to verify these, you can go ahead and keep your eye on the bars at the back of the example to see the effects that they have on the dynamic range of those particular colors, where our saturation values are higher over here than they are over here, as we can observe particularly with the red and green coloring changing from section to section. Alright, scene color is different from film, although it's set up in the same format to kind of showcase what's happening. The biggest difference between scene color and film is that scene color is predominantly about adding vignette, adding things like chromatic aberration, or you can use the technical term scene fringe, or tone mapping, which is control of the tonal shadows in a scene. The first one is going to be, I believe, vignetting. Let's go ahead and hit play here so I can walk into it. Which is very similar to your typical Instagram filter. Vignetting is the effect that you get when you are within a scene and you get some kind of outward shadows with like a cleaner interior line. It's almost like the effect that you get when you're running out of health in certain games. And is supposed to illustrate a more artistic quality. This works really well for stills or for certain conditions where the character has to be showcased a very specific item in the center of the screen. This is very artistic in terms of just using it for vignetting. If you've ever taken photographs before, then you'll understand how you can utilize vignetting to frame the subject matter of the element that you're looking at. Now, this is a screen effect. Let's go ahead and pop back in here so we can see it. This is a screen effect, not something that the character can avoid, so to speak. It's something that is applied to the UI, which means that the screen layer is being modified by the post-process volume here. The next one is chromatic aberration. Chromatic aberration is another effect that isn't necessarily super friendly to look at, but I typically, as kind of like a secret sauce, always add it to some of my scenes in some degree, because just the littlest amount of tone mapping adds a not insignificant amount of scene interest. So it does behoove you to actually spend a little bit of time understanding what and when you would want to use something like chromatic aberration. In this particular example, it's turned up incredibly high, and well, because it's turned up incredibly high, we have to just kind of deal with how ugly it looks. And I'll go ahead and walk through this in the next demo, but just kind of stick with me, guys and gals, as we go through and kind of explain what each of these do. The last one is the actual tone mapper. Let's go ahead and pop into the tone mapper here, and we can compare with the other section. Basically, the purpose of tone mapping is to modify the high dynamic range colors that a display can output. Or rather, the display can't be modified, but we can modify the information that's going to the display, especially if there aren't a lot of monitors left that still do LDR, which is basically low dynamic range. But if a monitor can't handle HDR or high dynamic range, this allows you to modify the way the colors are going to look during the normal rendering and post-processing process. So basically, the best way to explain how tone mapping works is it's a way to simulate the response that a film or some kind of film would have to light. it gives you a more filmic effect. Yes, I know the filmic is right over there, and we just talked about it, but this is also a supplementary filmic effect that comes from the tone mapping function that gives you a little bit more quality and lets you map the HDR a little bit differently, especially on monitors that can use it. So that means if you are on a monitor that does handle HDR, you can in fact clamp the values to give the feeling a little bit more of a rustic, old school kind of filmic feel, as opposed to it just being utilizing the HDR color and light range throughout the entire spectrum. We can clamp those values to get more of a look and feel like what we want. So bloom is the secret sauce that you see a lot of in a lot of games. I like bloom. I almost typically always add some bloom. Um, bloom is kind of like a visual phenomena. Let me go ahead and move into the scene here. If it lets me, come on. There we go. Bloom is a visual phenomena that you get. I can't really explain how it operates. I think it's a function of, say, the liquid in your eye plus the reflectivity of the light plus the reflectivity of the surface that you're looking at. But elements in real life do have some amount of bloom. And I think it has to do with not just reflections, but things like global illumination and whatnot. So it's basically phenomena. It's seen by the naked eye when you look at incredibly bright objects that are on a dark background. And that's typically the scenario that you're going to see it at. It almost looks like the object has its own emissiveness, but it's not necessarily that. Bright objects on a screen, for example, can sometimes also even cause streaks. Let's go ahead and move over a little bit so we can see what's going on. So you see the bloom color can affect the way that the ambient color is showing. So if we're having something that is pure white, and as you can see we do have some dirt on the screen. I don't know if anyone noticed that there was some dirt or a dirt mask on the screen. That's on purpose. If we move out of that, we see that we don't have a dirt mask. This is so you can showcase the bloom lighting. We can see that the lighting does change based on how this bloom is set. We'll talk about that when we get to it. The ambient cube map is designed to replicate something that looks like a skylight. I almost never use the ambient cube map because the ambient cube map generally has really limited screen space ambient occlusion and very limited global illumination, and also I question its overall effect if whether or not it's working very well in Lumen for you Lumen users. Let me just go ahead and show what this actually does. So let's go ahead and keep an eye on some of these darker colors and some of these darker areas over here, and we'll go ahead and see if I can walk a little bit slower. So do we see how that effect looks as though it adds ambient lighting? So everybody see kind of there's a subtle bluish effect? The general recommendation is if you need an ambient cube map, you probably should just add a little bit of power to your skylight, but if your lighting is perfect in most areas from your skylight, it might behoove you to think about adding an ambient cube light. Essentially what this does is it's based on viewer position and it's based on material roughness. It tries its best to add an element to the scene that appears as though it fills out the volume with light. Now, not the greatest effect. Again, this it's very similar to a skylight effect. But it's generally good, especially for certain areas that require a little bit more light that is not necessarily being achieved by the skylight or by adding more skylight to the scene. Yeah, that's more or less what the ambient cube map is supposed to do. Let's see if I can break that down a little bit more. I'm going to hop out of here and take a look at the actual element here. So as you can see in this particular scene, there is an ambient cube map. What it is it's using an HDR image to simulate a light in the scene, and this is the light that is being added to the scene via the ambient cube map. You guys can see it pretty clearly in the scene. And you see that its intensity does change, so of course we can go ahead and change the tint, for example, or change this. If we kick this off, this doesn't work so well. But we can up and down the intensity. Does everybody see kind of how that works? To simulate the color that we're getting from this particular scene, combined with our own custom tint. So you see how this can be useful for lighting certain areas. But again, this is a post process and has very limited shadowing. This is almost like a faked skylight and is worth looking into, especially if you have an area that you need a little bit more light in. However, recognize that post process volume doesn't always give the correct results, especially in relation to lighting. This is not a real light. This is using an ambient light, rather an ambient image, and is creating an effect on screen that is not a light. We are not adding more light here. We are adding the illusion of these colors, both the tint and the cube map intensity, as a cumulative effect. This is not a light. This is just kind of color grading the shadows to seem more like this particular picture. It goes without saying, but we've done this before. This is the auto exposure. You should be somewhat familiar with the settings from the lighting demo. I would strongly encourage, if you need a little bit more guidance on the adaptive eye, we can talk about it, especially when it comes to correcting the auto exposure. But essentially, I generally don't like the auto exposure in Unreal Engine. I will typically leave the lighting alone just so that I can get the best result I need. But auto exposure is nice to have, especially if you're going for like this full-on cinematic effect that allows you to change what each particular scene is looking at. We can look up and down this hallway. We can see how the post-process volume is affecting the way that our adaptive eye is looking at the world. And we've already played around with this, particularly in the sense that we are turning it off. Now, as we can see here, there are 3 separate post-process volumes with 3 separate settings. Let's go ahead and check these out real quick. We see that the exposure compensation and the overall speed is changed here. Min brightness, max brightness. And the final setting has some different settings with varying amounts of exposure compensation. So that's just kind of more or less a quick explainer. We can talk a little bit more about it in the next section of this demo. Our friend the lens flare. In this particular, let's see if I can kind of sneak my way in. In this particular sample, there's no lens flare where we're standing right now. So we can go ahead and take a look around at what the scene looks like. But if we go ahead and shuffle our way over to lens flare 1, we can see that the lens flares do have their own shape. If you guys remember from some of my discussions on creating lens flares and in some of the office demos, you'll see that lens flares do have their own ability to be shaped however we choose to. As you can see, there is no more screen dirt on the screen. What we're seeing is a reflection of what the lighting is doing to the camera. Let's go ahead and move over here. What we are seeing right now is the simulation of the scattering of light when looking through it through a lens. This has to do with the imperfection of camera lenses and is kind of a fake effect. If you have astigmatism or some form of eye degradation, let's call it that, there might be a scenario where your eye can actually pick up lens flares, especially because people who see the streaks at night, for example, who don't see clean headlights, not just the lensing through the windshield, but actual streaks from their eyes because they can't because their eyes are either formed in a way that is not necessarily helpful, or they're suffering from macular degeneration, or there's something about the surface of their eye that is encouraging light to behave in a way that is inconsistent with how a pure lens works. And eyes are already imperfect anyways. We can see that we can change this effect from going from one post-process volume in another. And that shininess, those little tiny hexagonal chunks, are typically referred to as bokeh, or bokeh, depending on how you want to pronounce it, which is a concept in artistry related to the imperfections of a camera lens, which adds a certain amount of, and you'll see bokeh a lot in depth of field, where you'll see lens flares and or very harsh vignetting and or blurring of objects with harsh lens flares in order to create an aesthetic effect related to said lens flares. The combination of all of those effects plus the ability to perceive them on screen space is bokeh. And you'll see that a lot in a lot of movies and cinematics. So, again, the nice thing about this is because of the versatility of the lens flare tool, we have the ability to change things like the shape of the lens flare. We have the ability to add thresholds. We have the ability to change how the lens flares work as a whole. As you can see, there is a bokeh shape over here. Unfortunately, this is the only shape that we have. I wish we had like a clean round bokeh, but by default, the default bokeh is going to look kind of like this because this has kind of like the Unreal look. This is set by the engine by default. Typically speaking, I would recommend changing it to something a little bit more natural to give you a more kind of confident result that looks more like a screen. But you see kind of how this effect works. This effect can be incredibly obnoxious, so it can be a little overpowering, but it's worth looking at when we actually have an opportunity to play around with it. Let's go ahead and move on. Ambient occlusion has a limited effect in Lumen. Ambient occlusion is a faked effect. I talked about this before with material-based ambient occlusion, but there is some ambient occlusion available in the default renderer for the Unreal Engine, and well, unfortunately, we don't have a lot of access to ambient occlusion when it comes to Lumen because Lumen is global illumination and it doesn't necessarily give us the best result, but this is just for samples only. Let's go ahead and move in. We can see how we can change the ambience. Pay attention to some of the tint bars, or rather our color keys, to see how those effects are affecting the dynamic range of, say, the color of red. Usually seeing the color red is how it's behaving to the post-process is a good example of what it's actually doing on the screen space. You see we lose a lot of range from our high red over there to our red being a little bit further out. Again, not my favorite effect. What this does is it simulates the effect of ambient occlusion on objects. We don't see it very much in this particular scene because ambient occlusion is already a very weak effect. We'll see it even less, if not even at all, in Lumen. Screen space reflections are part of Unreal 4. Unreal 5 will have different reflections related to the engine itself. We don't have to worry about screen space reflections, but just know that is in fact an option. However, we aren't using screen space reflections if we're using Lumen, but this goes to show what kind of quality the screen space reflections have, especially in a post-process volume. We can in fact control the quality pretty intensely. Let me demonstrate that while I can. This is set at 100% quality. This is set at a quality of 1. The default will be 50. And high quality is considered 100. As you can see, this is not something that's going to need to be worried about, especially when it comes to Lumen. Lumen reflections are not 100% great. Lumen reflections are different. We'll go ahead and talk about Lumen reflections when we're actually doing the sample demo, but that gives you a pretty good example of what we can do with screen space, assuming that your settings are set up for screen space. Again, we'll go into my project settings, we'll go into rendering. There it is, I always lose it. Mouse is a little too fast. And we'll see that my reflection method is set for screen space. If yours is set for Lumen, then the screen space setting is not going to work in the post-process volume. However, the post-process volume does have some final gather differences related to screen space that, let me put that back to default, might give you something that you would like a little bit more in relation to reflections. But bear in mind, Lumen reflections don't necessarily look as accurate, at least right now, because Lumen reflections rely on the Lumen scene in order for that to look crisp. And right now, Lumen scenes don't necessarily have a slider that we can add more quality to the reflections to get the best looking reflections. I'll go ahead and showcase that in a future demo. Global illumination works exactly as you'd think. By default, if you're using Unreal Engine 4, or if you're using Lumen turned off, your global illumination is going to be based on your indirect lighting intensity. This is also an option available to the GI inside of each individual light under a lumen. We'll showcase the differences, but I believe I've already covered them in the past demo. If there's more questions about GI in relation to lumen, that's going to be something that we can cover in a lab hour. We can talk about it. But essentially what we're seeing here is global illumination changing based on what we have in our post-process volume. As you can see, our default method, let's go ahead and turn on our I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but as you can see, our default method wants to default to Lumen. However, I have Lumen disabled for this project, so that's not going to work very well. I'm going to go ahead and disable that for now. But essentially, by default, by having the global illumination modified in your scene, we see that the different colors do affect the way that the global illumination intensity works. See? Now this is for Unreal non-Lumen users. Lumen users will talk a little bit more about global illumination. Global illumination for you is a little bit more set up to work from the light via indirect lighting intensity. For example, a light, let's go ahead and look at the components, has a volumetric and indirect lighting intensity. I generally encourage Lumen users to modify the light intensity here. However, you can add more light intensity via the post-process volume. Again, I don't necessarily like doing it after the fact, especially if I've already done any changes. But if you want to change lighting in a very specific area, you can, related to the post-process volume. So let's say if we're traveling from inside to outside, you can set a post-process volume that does have some effect on global illumination. And you can increase the lighting intensity from all lights, not just one light, all lights entering the scene based on this slider and these colors right here. And of course, you'd want to make sure that you were setting the correct method and your final gather quality. We don't have to worry about ray tracing global illumination because that's disabled for now, but if you're using Lumen, we'll showcase this in a future demo. In this particular example, we're going to showcase motion blur. Motion blur is a post-process effect that can be added to any particular screen space to basically add motion blur. What we're looking at right now is a default motion blur that is applied to generally all objects when we are at the default view. As you can see, it looks not necessarily blurry. However, let's see if we can get a better look here. It's going to be kind of hard to pick up, but there we go. Does everybody see kind of the difference there? This is applying a higher level of motion blur that gives a more cinematic feel, but motion blur is more of a filmic effect. Motion blur does have an overall effect on performance because objects that leave behind motion blur, not just characters, but objects move, can leave behind motion blur when they're inside of the post-process volume. And if we just kind of shuffle over here, we see that this is a lot crisper and is very similar to the default. Again, adding motion blur might make things look a little bit more fancy when they're moving, but can also have the opposite effect of looking like an object is flickering a little bit too wildly. If we look at this object over here, you can see almost like the result is based on whether or not the camera is moving. That is basically it. If the camera is moving, sometimes motion blur can get a little bit weird. I don't necessarily recommend motion blur as an effect that's this strong, but again, if we wanted to go ahead and take a look at motion blur, we can go ahead and show modified properties, and we can go ahead and click on the post-process volume, and we can see the different amounts of motion blur that are placed here. There we go. And I'll show these settings when we actually get to the sample here in a little bit. For any of you who've actually had an opportunity to play around with Valley of the Ancients, one of the examples it says is lower your screen percentage. Screen percentage is essentially the element of how much information is allowed to go into the Z buffer so that the engine knows whether or not to add more value or reduce the value of the elements that are put in the scene. In this particular case, let's see if I can get this working. Did everyone see that the quality has decayed pretty aggressively? Let's move out of the post-process volume here. See, that looks pretty normal. But if we go inside the post-process volume, we see that the quality has degraded aggressively. Let's see if we can move out of it. That looks pretty normal. Again, let's move out, back in, out, out. So what screen percentage does is it sets a certain amount of quality to the scene as a whole. Let's go ahead and click on the post-process volume. And it decays our screen percentage to 25%. So we lose 75% of the quality just from screen percentage. All screen percentage does is it renders the scene at a lower resolution and then scales it up. The lower your screen percentage, the lower the quality, the more scaling and stretching that you're going to have. So the value is going to represent a percentage of the overall resolution of the scene. 100% of the scene is going to have 100% of the pixels. 25% is going to have a fourth of, obviously, a fourth of the pixels, or rather, not a fourth, but you're going to lose 75% of the quality of your pixels, but it's going to scale it up to fit the screen because it cannot not fill all those pixels out, right? It's going to attempt to fill this out as much as possible. There we go. In order to give you the best upscaling quality possible. Screen percentages past 100 actually do the opposite. You get a higher resolution effect at a very, very, very high cost. We can see kind of the graininess back here. If we spend a little bit of time kind of observing the graininess in the back of the room, we see that it tends to go away as soon as we've moved outside of the screen space. Screen percentage is for rendering purposes. For anybody who I know who is going to be doing beauty shots in Unreal Engine 4, I would strongly encourage taking screenshots with screen percentage at 200%. It might make your engine crash, but again, screen percentage is about changing the quality of elements in the post-process volume when something is running. Something like this could be useful if you are running a very simple cinematic or very color-based cinematic that's supposed to have some degraded quality, or if you are running into performance issues. You could, in theory, reduce the quality of the screen percentage while you are in a specific area so that you are getting good performance, although strongly do not recommend. This is nice if you are going in a very specific scene and boosting the screen percentage if the character has no control or is going to be standing around, so you can get the best looking render possible at a very, very high resolution cost. Blendables is probably the most fun that you could legally have inside of Unreal Engine, because blendables allow you to create a volume that allows you to blend or bend the screen space in a way that is going to be, I would say, somewhat fun. The engine already has a lot of really complex post-processing, and essentially what you can do is apply a post-processing material. Do you guys remember when I was talking about material domains? Yeah, you can make post-processing materials to be used to do some very complex things to the screen. So blendables are also known, or rather, blendables are known as blendables are known as post-processing materials. Post-processing materials are essentially elements that can be used. Let's go ahead and take a look. To fake an effect that is on screen. For example, this has a nice little texture applied to it. That is just the Unreal Engine texture. Let's go ahead and close this. And let's go ahead and hit play. And we're just going to go ahead and walk in. Now there's other effects added to it to make it look kind of weird and wobbly, but as you can see, there's a texture that is being applied to the screen and a blending / bending mode that's being applied to the screen to showcase this aggressively. We can see that the Unreal Engine logo is available, and if we back out of the volume itself, we no longer can see it. Over here, we've applied a different kind of color matte to it. This is kind of the beginning of a cell shaded volume. Let's go ahead and take a look at that so we can explore it a little bit. And again, just changes the type of shadows that are being cast inside of the volume itself. So while we are inside the volume, we're casting different shadows, we're creating different effects, and it's actually pretty straightforward. All it is using a post-process input that's changing the color, multiplying the color, grabbing a grabbing a material expression, which in this particular case is the floor, and then using some divisive math to create an emissive color. And as we can see, the material domain is set to post-process. The only thing we control in post-process with a post-process set to a material domain set to post-process is the emissive color, and this gives us our overall result as a whole. This is just a utility node. Another element to keep in mind is post-processing volume priority. If we look under the post-processing settings, in this particular case it's easy to find, but there is a setting called priority. I'm going to read that verbatim. And this is important for the future, for the record. Priority this volume. In the case of overlapping volumes, the one with the highest priority overrides the lower priority ones. The order is undefined if two or more overlapping volumes have the same priority. What does that mean? Well, in this particular example, there are two post-process volumes. One post-process volume set at a priority of 2, where somebody went ahead and said that the default world was supposed to be 1, and one post-process volume set at a default property of 3. In this particular sample, if we go ahead and take a look over here at the details panel, we have a color grading change, where we have a saturation change, and we have a contrast change. We have a scene color change. Again, referencing what we learned all the way down here. And then while we are outside of that central volume, we have kind of the same thing. We have a saturation change, we have a color scene change, and we have a filmic tint change. Let's go ahead and take a look at what's happening here. As we step into the post-process volume, we'll notice that the effect adds to the screen a blood red coloring. However, since that post-process volume set in the middle there is set to a higher priority than the priority 2 post-process volume, which do you think is going to actually be on top? If we remember what it said in the explanation, the element on top is going to be priority 3. The higher the number, the higher the priority. This isn't consistent all the way around in Unreal Engine, whereas some priorities focus on the lower value. I know that some of the UI likes to say that the highest priority is 1 and the lowest priority is 0, but as a rule of thumb, the higher the priority, the more important that the engine thinks something is, and the more likely it is to be on top. So just keep that in mind going forward, and you likely will not run into a situation where it's flipped. I believe they have solved most of those issues from way back. But let's go ahead and walk forward. Does everybody see that the blending is occurring? All post-process volumes do blend within some capacity. So it doesn't have to be a hard shift. So we see while we're inside the post-process volume, it's overriding what is available in the other post-process volume. However, there is a transition period where we have like a lovely purple. Prince would love this. And as we exit, we can see the difference. Again, this is based on priority. We do have the option of blending, which is available under blend radius and blend weight. I'll talk about these when we get to the value here. Blend radius essentially is the space between the blending. This only deals with it if it's not unbound. The blend weight deals with how much the effect is going to be cumulative when the effect is being experienced by a post-process volume. Having multiple post-process volumes, for example, if we set this to 0.5 and then we set the other one here to 0.5 as well, we would have the purple effect cumulative inside of this purple volume here, or the central volume here. As I explained, blend radius and weight is used to change the transition from one post-process volume to another over a distance. And volumes can just take control of the post-process pipeline, or if they are using this setting, it can smooth the transition between two volumes over a distance set by the radius. So for example, blend radius here is set to 1,000 units. So we will start to experience the change in post-processing 1,000 units away from that post-process volume right there. Does everybody see kind of what's happening as we get closer and closer? So the post-process itself doesn't have to be bound. In fact, if we go ahead and take a look at this and we scroll down to the post-processing boundaries, you'll see that it is not unbound. It has just been allowed to blend out. Let me go ahead and look at the modified properties. It has been allowed to blend out further than its default location. And this makes for a much smoother transition over a period of time, especially if once we get to the center of the volume, we're supposed to experience 100% of whatever this is supposed to be. Again, while we are inside this volume, we're experiencing 100% of what this volume is supposed to look like. Let's actually go in a little bit further. It's a little more orange. But as we step away, we see that the orange is still affecting the element of the camera. In fact, we can even still somewhat pick up some elements somewhere around here. This is where the camera element is somewhat picking up some of that orange. It might be a little bit more difficult to tell for you guys on your guys' screen, but as I get closer, you see how that blend radius is working. I really don't think I have to explain this one. If I have to explain this one, I've failed you guys. This is infinite extents unbound. See if I can see some of the effects from it here. Let me get a little bit. We can still see some of the effects of the other one. Infinite extents deals mostly with, again, having the effect on or off at whatever extents it's at. So you can see there is some kind of extent that's being applied to the scene. This is the scene without with infinite extents turned on. This is affecting everything in the scene, absolutely everything. This is the global effect for this level. However, you'll see that a lot of different settings are set for this particular index, including adding things like a bokeh shape that we can't really see too well because we don't really have a camera or a light that is showcasing our light as powerful as it can be. Sorry about that, guys. Had a bit of a sneeze. But as you can see, this post-process volume, despite us being maybe all the way over here, I'm going to go ahead and turn up the intensity of the bokeh, and we see and we see that this is in fact affecting the entirety of the scene. However, if we go ahead and run all the way to the original scene over here, this is what the scene looks like with everything turned off. Let's go ahead and see what priority it's at. Yep, so it's set at a 1 priority. So we'll see that there are a bunch of different settings. These are all the individual settings inside of the engine as a whole in relation to what the post-process volume is going to do. We'll go ahead and break down the post-process volume here in the next demo, but this has been a demo on illustrating some of the content examples and showcasing what each of them do, their use cases, excuse me, and overall what the post-process volume is going to do for you when you are using it. I'm going to have a scene set up in the next demo, and we'll go ahead and play around with these options as we walk through and check some of these elements out. I will see you guys and gals in the next one.